traffic. My name is Joachim Kremers, and my colleague Lena Jehle and me are going to facilitate this panel here. The original facilitator had to cancel shortly, so we just jumped in, and I hope we can do a good job here. But before we dive into the topic, some technical notes that you may have heard before in this conference. If you have any problems on a technical matter, please write to the tech support. There's a button with a blue V on the left down side of your window. You can write to the tech support there. If you want to contribute something on the topic, like a question or statement, you can write it in our chat. It's a bit confusing. There are several chats here on Wordly, so please don't use the main chat that is right on the left here, where you can see also attendees and get together and stuff. No, use the chat button that's above here. So we can see it, and Lena will grab your questions and bring them in, even if you can't contribute with your own voice. In the beginning, we will listen to some short talks from our three speakers that I will introduce later. Afterwards, we try to get into a discussion on our topic. And as I said, if you have any questions or statements, please write them to us. Lena will have an eye on the chat and is gonna bring your voice in here. Okay, now we can turn on the thematic. Public space, and therefore also public transit, is not accessible for everybody in the same way. For many people, mobility means free space and social participation. From this view, public transit and its easy accessibility is essential for social equity. So in this panel, we will discuss how can a public be designed to give all people with the different requirements the same chance of mobility? How can we reach more men in struggle for gender justices? How can we come to a point of seeing that we all profit from inclusion and much more? Maybe, hopefully, we will see here some good examples for inclusion. And our three speakers are Sarah Ortiz Escalante, Isabel Duxfield, and Alexandra Miller. Sarah has a PhD in planning by the University of British Columbia. She's a feminist activist and urban planner, and she's member of the collective Punt 6, a co-op of Scientologists and planners and architects based in Barcelona, applying an intersectional feminist perspective in urban planning. The other is Alexandra Milonik. We have heard her in the morning for the keynote, and she's a researcher at the AIT, the Austrian Institute of Technology, in the mobility department. And she works in the area of dynamic transportation. And we also have Isabel Duxfield. I'm not sure if she has already arrived yet. Maybe she will arrive a little later. And she works at the Polis Network in the area of members and communication, and also in the group for gender perspective in urban mobility group. So I think we can start. And I think Alexandra wants to start with her little introduction and summing up what I was said in the morning. So welcome, Alexandra.
Yeah, thank you. I will try to sum it up. And first maybe just mentioning that I've been working on the topic of mobility behavior research for more than 15 years now, and some of our projects really are focusing on the transportation disadvantaged, so who experiences barriers of using public transport or other modes of transport for different reasons. And today in the morning, and I hope that many were able to join, but of course I understand that some of you might have other plans for Saturday mornings. I might have as well if I'm not giving a speech. But I was talking specifically about how inequalities develop and how they evolve, especially regarding men and women, female and male mobility behavior, and that we often see women as the future of mobility. They paved the way for sustainable mobility, but I put that in question a little bit, because I also asked about what are the reasons why women show a different mobility behavior than men. It is tied to different aspects. One of it being, of course, the urban development that we have been following for the last decades, with growing distances between different destinations, and also differences in what is available for poorer people, for people on the countryside as opposed to in the urban environment, and so on. And the main difference between men and women is that women have a lot more responsibilities in the household, in the family, which causes them to have more trips than men, have shorter trips, more complex trip chains, and they also use more public transport and walking than men. And this is also tied to specific influence factors. I was talking about 3 components, defining which mode of transport, for example, you choose and which trip to take. And that we put a lot on the physical barrier-free access to mobility, but there are also other barriers, like ability barriers with complex systems, for example, not being used to a specific system. And very much so, there are emotional barriers for women when it comes to, for example, being concerned about their safety, being concerned about feeling ashamed if they make mistakes, and if they lose their way or something like that. And all these components also very strongly lead to difference in the mobility behavior, and also to more burden on the mobility patterns of women. So in another study, we found out that, for example, single parents, mostly women, of course, as well as mothers of larger families, or very old people who are, at least in Austria and in Germany as well, I think, mainly women, because they usually survive their partners. They show differences to the average mobility behavior. So mothers, for example, having more trips, being longer in the transport system, and older people, also people with disabilities, having less trips, fewer trips, and spending less time in the mobility system than the average. So this is kind of an indication of the inequalities in being, we can measure it in the mobility behavior, that this has some influence. And I also described a short thought experiment, how we could bring gender and sustainability issues in one solution, where I described the content of a project, a smaller study that we did, which we will continue now in 2 larger projects, one in Austria and one transnational in Europe, where we look at mobility budgets and with fair mobility budgets, so that the amount of emissions that is actually still sustainable and that we can afford is distributed in the among the citizens, and those who need more mobility, like women or people who are not living in a city, they receive more certificates. And this could also be a motivation for those who are not taking that many responsibilities to wanting to have more certificates, and also taking over some of the responsibilities. And we will look into that now more closely in the upcoming projects, and it will be very interesting to see not just how can we make mobility sustainable by limiting the amount of emissions that somebody can emit, and also providing a fair distribution, which will be fairly difficult to establish, I think, but also what is the actual the basic need of mobility that people have. So that's not really defined, and we're trying to find it out in the project.
Okay, thank you very much for your very precise summary. And so I give the floor to Sarah.
Yeah, I could do it in a couple of minutes, and I talked about it 45 minutes. Yeah, so.
Very great, thank you.
Thank you, Alexandra. I'm glad to hear your perspective, and very exciting the project that you are talking about. So I'm Sara Ortiz Escalante from Collective Punsis, and we are a cooperative of urban planners that basically what we do is urban planning projects integrating a feminist perspective, an intersectional feminist perspective, and we work in different areas of planning, in public space, in the design and of facility networks, housing also, issues of safety, women's safety. And one of the topics that we work on is on mobility. And working on mobility from a feminist perspective is related with all what Alexandra was saying. So we look also at the different patterns of women and men and how also that impact women's right to the city and their access. And basically, we define that we look forward for a mobility system that includes this perspective in the sense that change the priorities, because now a lot of mobility systems are focused on the productive sphere or on how to help move people from home to work. And this is a very male-centered model that it continues being replicated. So changing the priorities means also put like the other mobilities that are even larger in percentage among all groups, populations, but also overall among women. Most of women's mobility, at least for example in areas like in Barcelona or Spain, are related with care work, right? And as Alexandra was saying, so that's one thing, to change that priority, because also for gender justice, women have a more sustainable mobility, and we have to change the priority, and also not to make easier for women to take care of others, but also to value care and make it that it's a public and community responsibility and not only a household responsibility that at the end ends on the shoulders of women. So with this perspective. The second thing is that we also, in the projects that we do, is we address issues. We propose to expand the vision of safety and security related with mobility and transportation. It's been very related to traffic, but we, including a feminist perspective, means to expand this perception, this view, to amplify the perceptions of safety that vary by gender, but also by ages, right? How an elder woman moves is very different than of how a young woman might move, for example, and the perceptions will be different for different situations. But also addressing through the mobility systems violence against women and girls, because still, well, we live in a society that is patriarchal and sexist, and there is a lot of gender violence around the world. So that also impacts women when they move and in this transportation and mobility systems. So that's another thing that we are working on. And the third one is that, as you have heard through the conference, women are a minority still in the transport sector. So it's important to work towards gender equity and increasing the amount of the number of women who are in the different levels of the scale, different scales of responsibilities in the mobility and transportation systems. But also from our perspective, we believe that it's essential that mobility and transportation policies start to be planned through the active participation of their users, and in particular through women, and including also qualitative analysis and qualitative data that completes the quantitative analysis, where because most of the transportation planning is based in quantitative data, but they lack a perspective that looks at different scales, more to the community and neighborhood scale. They often look at the city scale or the metropolitan scale, losing a lot of information because they are working in big sets of data that also sometimes lose the diversity of people and the complexity of the mobility of people. So with that, with those objectives in mind of what we understand by mobility from a feminist perspective, what I presented yesterday is a feminist participatory action research that we conducted with women night shift workers in the metropolitan area of Barcelona. It was not only focused on mobility, but it was focused on different issues of urban planning. But mobility was one of the issues that came up, definitely, because mobility, transportation offer, public transportation reduce a lot at nighttime, and they face the challenges of moving at certain times of the night when they go to work or come back from work through public transportation, when there is a lack of frequency, very deficient intermodality. And also, this is totally related and interrelated with the perception of safety. Women being waiting like in isolated areas, bus stops, train stations, metro stations for a long time. Because also women night shift workers have a more sustainable mobility. Women night shift workers work at night because of an economic reason, and oftentimes because it's easy for them to take care of others. They work during the night and they take care of their children and dependents during the day. So they cannot afford to move in another way. So they move by foot, by public transportation, by bike, and few of them move by car. So they face also the challenges of this system that has been thought mostly on the daytime, but also mostly on the main mobility. So one of the conclusions that we got is that on one hand, women work very close to home, in geographical distance. It would take them 10 or 15 minutes to arrive home if they drive. But since they use public transportation or they walk, sometimes it takes them 1 hour and 1 hour and a half. So that's something that we analyze that also impacts their health and their well-being, because that also increases issues of health, of being tired, but also the stress of being waiting and commuting for a longer time at certain times of the day. And of course, they encounter issues of sexual harassment, sexual violence, and a lot of perception of unsafety and fear at nighttime. That also something that came from that. From this project, we didn't only do analysis, we also did recommendations, and we had an action plan to bring to different transportation policymakers and authorities. And we were able to push for some changes in the metropolitan area. As I said yesterday, for example, the metropolitan area has started to have the service of request a stop between two official stops in the bus at night. And that comes directly from the recommendations of this project. Also, we were able after that to start doing more work with mobility and transportation institutions. We have been doing gender audits in stations of railway companies in Catalonia. We've been also giving advice to the transportation authority in the big region of Barcelona to mainstream a gender perspective in mobility, because sometimes I think that a lot of European cities think that they are advanced in many issues, but when it comes to a gender perspective or to a feminist perspective, I think there are other countries and other cities in Africa, like Maputo, or in Mexico City, or in Buenos Aires, that they are some years in front of us, and they have started to work on mobility issues from a gender perspective, but not here in Europe. So we are, at least in Barcelona, we are still catching up, and we are doing this kind of work of advice. And just to finish, we also have done work, we have been working for 50 years. We are based in the city of Barcelona, but we've worked with more than 100 cities and towns in Spain and around the world, mostly in Latin America. And also mobility is, when you work in urban planning, you work always with the issue of mobility. So we've done a lot of projects also related with active mobility, for example, designing a school paths also but from this gender perspective, to try also to make a community responsibility the activity of taking care of the kids when they go to school and promote their autonomy to go to school, but also making the neighbors and the community and the retail stores that are around responsible also for being surveying and giving support to the kids when they go to school. And we recently also did the first study of cycling mobility from a feminist perspective in the city of Barcelona. That it has been a city that has increased a lot the cycling infrastructure, but without analyzing or thinking who uses this infrastructure for what and what needs. So we decided through a small grant to start a longitudinal study And we have conducted a survey for 2 years in a row that we hope to be continuing, combined with participatory workshops with women cyclists, but also with women who are non-cyclists, to learn why they don't cycle and what are the learnings. So these are some of the examples of the things that we do. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you as well, Sarah, for your coming up. Yeah, unfortunately we didn't hear anything from Isabel, so we will just continue with you two. And so I encourage everybody in the audience, you can write in the chat if you have any questions to them or any statement if you want to contribute to the discussion. And now I will hand over to Lena with the question.
Yeah, so thank you for your introductions and your opening. I have just one question to you too. So both of you talked a bit about your research and about how cities should change. And so I would like to hear from you. Maybe you can describe one day in a city that you see that would be more inclusive, more feminist, more equal for all genders and all people. Like, how would it look like? How would you move around? How would people get around? Can you share some images with us?
I don't know, Sarah, would you like to go first?
Well, it's fine. Go you first, and I
Okay.
can add to your comments.
Okay. Well, I think when we think about a just city where everybody has the same opportunities and chances, would also require, of course, all people take the same responsibilities and make sure that the burden is not just on one side. But I think that we should maybe also, more in general, turn away from the perspective on mobility as such, because mobility is not a means it is a means to achieve something. It's not a reason in itself. So when I think about, and this is not a new idea, when I think about the future of mobility, or a future city, or should be there already, is to make sure that everybody has the chance to do as much as possible without having to turn any motorized mode of transport, be it public, be it private. More having all the facilities nearby in a walkable or cyclable distance, to make sure that you also have bicycles, for example, where you can carry goods with you, where you can do run your errands. And also a very important factor is also a just distribution of space, because at the moment all the areas, all the places, space in a street is more or less mainly reserved for cars, and for really getting around and also encouraging people and make them feel safe to walk around and to cycle around. We need more space for them, and this would also encourage a change in behavior. But as I mentioned in the morning, it's not enough. It's not just the material that you need and the access that you need. It is actually really also, if you can walk somewhere, if you can cycle somewhere. Of course, you need to learn to cycle. You need to be courageous enough to cycle in a city. If you have enough space for that, that's easier. And if more people are doing it, it's easier as well. So I think that a redistribution of space is very important. And also, if you can walk and cycle, it's not complicated. You don't need to read a map. You don't need to read a train schedule or something like that. So it's very easy then to use the environment. You know your environment very well. There are no corners that you are unfamiliar with which are raising fear, for example. So if we can kind of have cities of smaller neighborhoods where you can spend most of your life in there. And maybe also if you want to work for a firm and it's far away, okay, you can use a workspace you share with others, for example. So that would be something in the future. You do have then communication with other people, not necessarily only with the ones that you work with, but also with others, so you don't feel lonely, but still you don't have to commute a far distance. So I think such as it's they like to call it 15-minute city is something that we should strive for. But of course this would also require not just the redistribution of space, but also make sure that we have the facilities that we need in a walkable distance, and we would have much more mixed use, for example, in the communities and in the neighborhoods, to make sure that we have this variety of facilities. And I think what also needs to be done, which cannot be solved by a redistribution of space and new mobility concepts, is we need a new perspective of what are the roles of men and women and of different people, and really put more emphasis and give more value to the unpaid work that women are doing, for example, and really make it also desirable for men to do such work, or find another clue how to distribute it in a fairer way. But this needs to be solved. It is not only to be solved in a planning environment and in a transport environment. It's a society issue that we need to solve, and this takes a lot of time, a lot of effort, and of course the willingness of everybody. And I am maybe a bit pessimistic that I don't think that we can change it very quickly. Still hoping that we maybe manage to do it in 1 or 2 generations, but it really takes a lot of effort, and it also takes a lot of support from all levels, the citizen level as well as the policy level. So we need alliances to achieve that. And me as a mobility researcher, mobility behavior researcher, I only have a little glimpse of how to do that, and maybe the mobility budget is one thing to support something like that, but that's also something that needs policy support. So let's see. We don't give up.
Thank you. So I'm glad to hear from Sarah some of the images, or like the approaches to a more inclusive and gender equal city. What would it look like?
Yeah, well, I agree with all what Alexandra said. These are elements that are essential. And I really like what you are also studying, the mobility budget, because also I think if we don't include a gender perspective in that budget, it's difficult to change things at the end, also at the policy level. So to complement or like to add some of the things that lately we have been trying to define kind of like the qualities that mobility system from a gender perspective should have. So I will start for the first one, the central, that should be focused on equity and should be participatory, a little bit related with what I said before. That we believe that every place is different. So whatever is the response or the transformation, it has to be contextual, and also work understood, assess, and transform with the community who lives in that place, right? In their diversity. So when we talk about more equity and more participatory, is that we need the women in their diversity to be in those spaces. As technicians, as experts, as mobility planners in the different levels of decision, but also women users and residents of the different neighborhoods, because for double and triple journey of doing also the care work, we are the main experts of the territory. We know how things work, what things are working, what things don't work. So also find the ways that we gather the knowledge and the expertise of women in the different contexts is essential also to make transformations that respond to those issues, to change the priorities, to give more space for walking, for cycling, to reduce the physical space that cars occupy currently in cities. In a city as compact as with mixed use like Barcelona, cars occupy 70% of the space, and that's incredible. So imagine in a context where the suburbs and the sprawl is the model of the city, that's even more challenging to change these priorities. So yeah, it's as I agree with Alexandra, it's going to take decades to change these kinds of things, but we have to move towards that. So besides this quality of being more equitable and more participatory, we thought that the mobility system has to be focused on the everyday life and care in the complexity. So it has to respond to care activities. So when we think, for example, of walking infrastructures or walking spaces, it's not only essential the proximity, but how these spaces are equipped. Do we have benches? We have been working, for example, in projects of creating a network of benches that responds to the needs, for example, of elders, or to the needs of the people who are dependent or who are caretakers, right? Benches are an essential infrastructure for everyday life and for mobility, of course, because there are people, for example, with certain diseases. If you have Parkinson, you cannot walk more than 10 minutes without sitting in a place. So that might stop you from going to somewhere. So benches, public toilets, or cities, in many places there are no public toilets, and this is a women's essential needs. We need physiological needs that make us more dependent on the public toilet. And now with the COVID-19 situation, we see that we cannot access to public toilets for ourselves, but also for our children. You go to the park, you go to the plaza, and where your kid has to pee where it goes. So it has to be equipped with certain services for the everyday life that are necessary. And the same for public transportation stations. They are thought as people only move and go fast and up and down, but also public transportation stations should be thought as places of care, because we don't travel alone. We usually travel accompanied, and we have to think in this interdependence of people and the vulnerability of people too. The third characteristic that we also say, it has to be accessible, of course, and universally accessible, not only with people with physical disability, but also people that have sensorial and other kind of disabilities, but also thinking of the different states of and of health of people. Also the way that certain public transportations are designed influence a lot in the phobias and mental health issues. And few times we think of that, or the diversity of bodies. Things are thought in a kind of like type of measure as everybody measures the same, and it's not. So thinking of children also travel, people that go with a wheelchair travels at a different height, elders that go with walkers, etc. So it's also important to make a system accessible. The fourth one is to make it safe, and also to safe and free. That's what we say, and that's what I said before, that we have to make sure that people has autonomy to move at any time of the day and night, independently of their gender and their age. And I think we are very far from achieving that. And this is, again, also, as Alexandra said, a social issue. Also, it's not only one thing that physically we can help to make a place visible and to increase the vitality of that place, but if we don't change things at the social and cultural level, that will be impossible to change. And the fifth characteristic that we said is that has to be also thought from a night perspective, and from a how you say in English, from a weekend or non weekday perspective, because as you know, in many cities it seems like that we don't move at night or we don't move on the weekends, and all the public transportation frequency goes down and things like that. And there are a lot of people that move not only for working reasons, but also because they go to do leisure activities, but also because they take care of others. So we have to incorporate also the night and the weekend perspective in the mobility systems.
So thank you too for the insights.
Maybe we can just quickly add something. In the project a couple of years ago, where we looked at 15 different groups, disadvantaged groups, we also found out it's not just about the trips being barrier-free. For example, some older people told us we would like to go to the theater, but it's fine if you can go there and there are barrier-free public transport means that you can take. But if the theater is not barrier-free, why go there? So we have to make sure that also the destinations are accessible for them.
Exactly, yeah, and go to like large elements, but also very small elements. I'm thinking also on the work with elders, even the maintenance of the pavement is something so essential, because if as a tile is a little bit up and has, I mean, that can increase the perception of fear because they can fall. And things like that, oftentimes we don't think from a planning office that that's a problem and that we should do that. So I think that's important to plan and execute whatever the change we're doing as maintaining it and making sure that things remain clean, remain maintained, remain in a good shape.
Yeah, thanks for the really practical ideas and images. Now we got some questions from the audience, and the first one is from Volker, who's asking, if we look at less developed countries, so probably countries from the global south, we see they skip the fixed line telephone. Is there a chance there might be places where current errors in development of public transport would be skipped as well? So Sarah already referred to cities of the global south and their development, which is sometimes more feminist. Maybe you have an answer to ideas to this.
Yeah, I don't know if I understand correctly the question. I don't know if Volker means that in certain places they don't use directly public transportation and then they will be more walkable and more cycling spaces. I mean, my answer maybe will be different from what you expect, Volker. But again, I say that it's important to learn from different territories, and different territories have different experiences and different situations. So I've been learning continuously from what it's called less developed countries, and I'm from Europe. So I think most of my learnings come from Latin America and from other countries in the South, because maybe they don't have the superiority that they think that they know everything. So sometimes there are certain topics that are addressed in a different way. That doesn't mean that, of course, that every place is different. So the only thing that I can say is in the terms of including a gender perspective in some mobility plans, that are cities in the global south that are doing changes faster than cities in Europe. And as I said, in Mexico City, for example, they've been for decades working on how to make the city safer for women, because the issues of femicide and violence against women in the city, they detected that the public transportation system was one of the main areas where women were receiving different types of sexual harassment and sexual violence, and they decided to respond to that, but to respond to that not only addressing issues of violence, but also with policies to increase the number of women workers in the different scales of the mobility systems, and also to start analyzing and studying the mobility in a different way. So they have already include issues of interdependence and issues of mobility of care in their service, for example. And there are other places in Latin America, I can tell, Buenos Aires, Quito, Ecuador, Santiago de Chile, and others, San Salvador, that are doing that. Recently, also, I had representation from Maputo, Mozambique, that they have been also working how to improve the infrastructures related with bus transportation, and they have done like amazing work trying to improve the bus stops, how they have to be like the shelters of the bus stops and things like that to make it accessible and safe. And they have a lot of challenges in terms of accessibility, definitely, no, because of the state of the roads, the maintenance. And those places are places that don't have much budget. So having more budget or being more rich doesn't mean that you are giving the best solution. So I think it's something that maybe, for me, it raises a lot of questions, right? Where we put the priorities in certain places and others.
Yeah, I think I do understand what Fokker means, but I think it's two different things. When they are skipping landlines, it is actually it's easy to skip landlines not only to have mobile phones, cell phones, because you save actually infrastructure. If you build landlines to every household, it takes a lot of infrastructure. It takes a lot of cost. So skipping that is actually something that comes at hand, because it saves money. And Sarah already said it's also a question of budget and where do you invest the budget that you have, and even a scarce budget. I think with public transport it's a little bit more difficult, because I'm not sure if it's possible on the one hand side to skip something, skip errors that we made now in the developing countries and come up with a better system, because for the more modern and more barrier free and the better system, you need newer material, and usually in the developing countries they don't buy the new material, they buy the old material that we get rid of. So I think it is very, very difficult to have some kind of the same strategy here to do that. But what I think is that in developing countries, it's not necessarily the case that they have to learn that much from us, but as Sarah already said, we also can learn a lot from them, because we took a big detour over car transport and making cities most usable for cars, and now we are trying to turn around here, whereas in the developing countries they are now at risk to make our mistakes, and they should avoid that, and they have some very good concepts of public transport, which is more on demand than in our cases, for example. And if taking up these ideas and also then building the necessary material for it could be something that improves our public transport system as well. So I think we should not think that we make everything better than anybody else, but we should all learn from each other.
Thank you. So we move on to the next question from Amata. She says, Amata says, for me, the big question is, how do we get there? How do we get away from car-dominated mobility to access for all, and not just in big cities, but also in rural areas? And there's an addition in the chat which says, until recently, I did everything by bike, which to me appeared to be the most sustainable option I had, given that in my town I was faster by bike than by bus. But now, after healthy issues, I may not longer be able to do this as much, and I experience what I always saw with others. Who in my town does not own a car is shut out from a lot of activities.
Yeah. I'll go shortly, but on one hand, I think the big problem, to frame it, also the big problem is the car use in the cities, first of all, because if you look at issues of pollution, one of the main issues is the pollution that we have in urban areas worldwide because of car use or motorized vehicles, right? So also to kind of like balance, because we are going forward to be more and more an urban population worldwide. So we definitely have to focus on how to solve that at the city level. Although definitely it's an issue also in rural areas, but when we look at like data, the mobility in rural areas is not as huge as in cities. So also to kind of like give like the gravity of the situation to certain issues. But definitely what you say, Amata, is very relevant, right? Not everybody, well, there is not always infrastructures to move in rural areas with a bike, right? At different times of the day and night, or even walking, right? Even like towns that are very close, sometimes they could have like a sidewalk or like a path that connects one town with the others, but towns that might be like separated by a kilometer, by a half or two, but that even don't exist, and people depends on cars. So I think it's the main challenge. I think the challenge pass not only by public solutions, but also by community solutions and looking at ways to share mobility systems. From a bottom-up way, from sharing cars, and also through the public transportation or the public policy solutions, look at very imaginative solutions to make sure that you can provide services in rural areas, but they also contextualize and accommodate it to the system. Sometimes, I'm going to talk about my context because it's what I know. Sometimes they put a huge bus that goes from a town to the other, and the bus is empty and goes like all the time in a particular schedule, and that might be not very efficient in any of the senses, because the car is going on all the time, the bus, and there's not enough people, and maybe it doesn't respond to the schedules of the people because it's a bus that passes every 2 hours, so people cannot rely on the bus anymore. So at least here, some of the things that they are doing is to do more like systems of buses on demand in small areas where you can reserve or you can call to a bus that is like in a particular area, and if you call them, they come to pick you up. It's kind of like a collective taxi, and again, it's something that has happened in many other places around the world, probably more in the south, but here in the north, sometimes we are very respondent to legal issues and how we can do that and things like that. And now, at least here, we are starting to see how we can do more on-demand transportation that responds to the needs of the people and also are more efficient in many ways, economically and sustainable.
Well, how do we get there? I think the strategies that we use at the moment, trying to lure people out of the car, they're not working. We have tried for a long time to develop incentives and talking about sustainability and ask people to be more responsible and so on. But what we measure, what we see, is that traffic is increasing. It's still increasing. There's no change in the trajectory, and so I'm afraid, and that's bad news for policymakers. It will not go without some pressure. And of course, it is necessary and mandatory to also provide alternatives, make sure that people have alternatives, but it's also necessary to limit and to reduce car use, to reduce the space for cars, to reduce the fast connections for cars. And in this way, we would, and also with mobility budgets, for example, we would force to have more local communities where you can have more facilities in shorter distances. So reversing the trajectory that we had in urban planning, for example. The issue is, and the big problem is, that we should have that the change in the physical environment already. Out of equality reasons and out of sustainability reasons and climate change. We should have that in 20, 30 years at the latest. And usually urban development, regional development takes a lot longer. So it's really difficult to achieve that, and it really takes huge effort and people willing to do that, and people also to take radical decisions. And also, what we also need is a better comprehensible explanation of what it actually means to everybody and each of us. Because I think talking about climate change, for example, that's in Austria, we need to save until 2050. We need to save 20 million tons of CO2. I have no idea how much it is, what it means for me. I don't know. So we need to make it more comprehensible for everyone. But what does that mean for me? What is my role in that? Because otherwise we cannot connect to that, and we don't see it as our responsibility. So this is a very important factor, which also makes it easier for policymakers to take more radical decisions and to make maybe unpleasant decisions, because people can understand it, they can follow it, they can also, they know why they do it. And that's necessary. Of course, not everybody is going to praise that and be on board. But we need to make sure that we take this trajectory in a different direction. And we also do, for example, backcasting. So that means we look into the development goals a city has, for example, on different levels, on the societal level, on the environmental level, the economic level. What are the goals that a city actually has? What are the indicators for that? That we build kind of a desirable future out of those indicators. And of course, not everybody goes together. Economic goals go not that well with environmental goals, for example. So we have to prioritize. And as soon as we know, so this is the goal, these are the values of the indicators that we want to reach, then we can backcast, we can form a pathway, and then we can see what are and they may be really drastic and radical interventions that need to be taken then. But this is the only way to make sure that we take this turn, and that we actually can follow a path that leads to a desirable future. And I'm not a big fan of forecasting, for example, because if we start from here and we try out this intervention, that intervention, we might land somewhere, but not necessarily there where we want to be. So thinking about what we actually want to have, describing that, knowing what would be the indicator values is very, very important. And I just see we need better data on individual needs. Yes, but we already know a lot. So we know a lot about individual needs. We know a lot about how people decide and what is important for them. What are their values? What is their personal situations? We know a lot about them. We should know more about the emotional barriers. That's absolutely something we don't know that much about, and how to address that. The barriers to change behavior. So I think we should take every opportunity to collect data and also think about what do we actually measure. Is it the right indicator that we measure? If we measure the capacity of roads for cars, for example, is it really is it a measure that's relevant for us, or is it more reachability of different facilities, for example, kind of a mobility indicator showing if you can actually reach all the destinations that you need to reach within a certain time, for example, without having to turn to being dependent on a car, for example. So we really have to think about what is the data that we need. Should we follow with the set of data that we have, or should we rethink it? And if we don't have the right data, well, we need to find ways to collect the correct data, the data that we actually need for that. And of course,
thank you very much. I need to interrupt for a moment because fortunately Isabel can join us now.
Oh, okay.
So we can
I'm
hear.
quite already.
No problem, no problem. So, okay.
Can you hear me?
We can't
Say it
see
again,
you.
Isabella.
No, you won't be able to see me, but can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Okay, that's fantastic. Yeah. So
Very
yeah,
well.
I think I put a message in the comments about data.
Yeah.
And yeah, so my point is to get people out of cars, we have to create public transport which serves a whole spectrum of individual needs, and so that the public transport becomes an option which is a viable option, alternative to a car, for everyone. So particularly if we think about women taking children to school, not just women, but men taking children to school as well, the types of trip chaining that we know women do. That's why I'm talking about data, but how do we understand people's not just getting from A to B with a mode of transport, but their whole spectrum of their mobility and their day-to-day mobility, and how can you create a transport system around that and that serves those needs. And some cities have been very, very good at this, and some less so. And so how do we learn off those cities that are doing it very well, which I think is super interesting. And there's some really good examples of cities running pilot projects where these really innovative approaches to public transport are being trialed. So in cities, let's take an example like Helmond, which is piloting some really, really interesting things. So how can we learn from those? Taking the micro to macro. But yeah, I wonder what people thought about that.
Yeah, thank you very much for your response, Isabel. We also want to give you the chance to introduce yourself and your work a little further. Unfortunately, you couldn't be in the start here. So if you want to say some more words about you and what are you doing and your perspectives. We also had the question earlier, what would be like a perfect day for you, like in a perfect inclusive mobility system in a city? Yeah, what would that look like? So if you want to answer a little bit about that, we'd be glad.
Yeah, so hi. So my name is Isabel. I work for Polis Network. We are a network of cities and regions, and we encourage dialogue and encourage action around sustainable mobility. And we run a lot of we're involved in a lot of pilot projects around sustainable mobility. So that's electric charging, cycle lanes, so active mobility, safety. So it's really bringing cities together to talk about best practices, so how they're on the ground, how they're encouraging their citizens out of cars and onto public transport and active modes of travel. So I think, so I'm streaming in from Oxford and watching everyone cycle around, and so I think that my fantastic day of mobility would be that obviously everyone's on a bike, we're getting from A to B on a bike. Actually, no, to put that better, I think this was put to me really nicely by someone in one of our member states in Holland, and it was that it is easier to get to your destination by bike than it is by car. When we have done that, we've achieved it. I think. And so how do you get there? Not just building the infrastructure for cycling, but building a mindset around cycling and a mindset around sustainable mobility, that the car doesn't become the go-to anymore. That you don't instantly think, how am I going to get to my destination? I'm going to go by car. That's the last resort. And that is fantastic. Imagine that, we create a world where the car is the last resort. You can't quite imagine it now in some places, but it can be. So I think a lot of my work is around that. And so a lot of my work is around gender perspectives in mobility. So how do we encourage women and other groups who aren't necessarily served by public transport to be able to access it? So we think about women's safety, which is super important to us at the moment. So how do we say, because we know from multiple research that safety is a huge concern for women using public transport, and their reluctance to use public transport and an ability to use public transport in some places really inhibits access to healthcare, employment, education. And so thinking about how we encourage women to use it more, but not just encourage them to use it, because we know women do use public transport, but how do we improve their experience of public transport and remove the fear that some people have using it? Yeah, I hope that answers you.
Yeah, thank you very much and welcome. I'm glad that you could come. So I think Lena, my colleague, has a question now for you three.
Yeah, thank you, Isabel, for coming, for joining. Since the three of you are researchers focused on gender issues, I would like to ask you, and I also got some insights of your data collection and your research methods, which I found really interesting. And I would like you to talk about this a bit, because you said already that the way data are collected, the way research is planned, it's a lack of qualitative research, and it's a lack of, as you said, maybe live-based or like really relevant data. So maybe you want to tell us about your way of data collection, your research methods, your methods of knowledge production that help us to strengthen this perspective of how to look on the city that we would like to have. How do we get there from a research perspective? Thank you.
You want me to start? Well, I think that's most of what we do, because we are a very qualitative oriented organization. So we actually work with secondary quantitative data sets, but our goal is always to complete that with qualitative work. And I think not many people do it, working in mobility issues or urban planning issues. So I can tell you about different research methods. I can refer you to our guides. We have published 4 guides with methods to work different issues in urban planning that are in our webpage and are downloadable. One of them is Women Working. It's translated to English, and actually this guide includes like all the methods that we have used for a period of time with different groups of women that we have worked with more than 100 groups of women that we have worked in the region of Catalonia in Spain. And because at the end, most of the methods have to adapt it with the group that you meet to, and also with their age, with their abilities, with their interests, and et cetera, et cetera. But kind of one of the things that we always look when we use these methods is first, that we create a process where people reflect from their own personal experience towards the group and collective experience, right? Because sometimes it's difficult when there are, for example, participatory process about urban planning, that they don't go through the personal reflection and through a group reflection, for example, and they start a process of consultation, and they say, okay, what do you want in this square? Or what do you want in this street? If you don't do a reflective process with the people, it's very difficult that people contribute in a way that is not thinking only about their wishing personal list, right? So for us, it's very important, go through the process, going from the everyday life of every person, doing an introspective work, and then share that with other people to understand and get empathy and see that the lives of people are very different, and we can have some things in common and some things that are very different or very opposite. And then that also creates a climate that can help you to work together towards a common goal, or how we can transform that place that responds in a better way to the diversity of needs of that community, right? So that's a way to do it. And we use from a lot of mapping, working from maps of the community, and very focused on how is the everyday life network of people, and how people develop their daily activities of the different spheres, not only the work spheres, but making visible and valuing all the work related with the care work at home, but also the care work in the community, for example, and how that it's how people develop these activities in the everyday life, and what are the elements of urban planning or mobility that help them to develop these activities, right? And what are the elements that make difficult their daily lives. And of course, as I said before, the perception of safety different for men and women, and mostly working on improving women's perception of safety is at the center also of many of these participatory processes. And seeing what are the things that impact their right to different activities, because at the end, yes, safety is an issue that affects women, but that doesn't mean that we not all of us have the privilege to risk, or the privilege to say, okay, I'm not going to move, or I'm not going to go to this place, right? So we use a lot different types of mapping, from community mapping, small size mapping, large size mapping in the public space that work very well to get a lot of information from the community. We do a lot of mobile methods. For example, we do exploratory walks to work issues of safety with women. We do more walks with mixed groups to analyze other issues of everyday life. We use body mapping. I was presenting that yesterday also, to also analyze the first territory that affects us, which is our bodies, and that oftentimes planners forgot, because it's something private. So why we have to talk about the bodies? But it's what gets impacted by pollution, by violence, but everything that happens in a city. And also we have used over the time like visual methods that can gather a lot of qualitative information too.
Thank you. Maybe Isabel?
Hello. Yeah, sorry, I'm having some trouble with technology at the moment. Yeah, just to add to that, the mobility is a incredibly emotional experience, isn't it? Really, how we get from A to B and get around. And so, yeah, I'd like to add to that how do we do a lot of surveys on things which are just tick boxes on, how long does it take you to travel to school? A, 15 minutes, B, an hour. And actually to enable mobility and transport services to serve individual communities and understand what individuals want, you need a much more qualitative process. So a lot of my research has been using focus groups and individual interviews to understand more emotional connections, and things like when you really run a focus group with, say, young women about their experiences sitting on a bus and their experiences of harassment, and you understand in 15 minutes sitting down with them a lot more than you would from a survey that took them 15 minutes to complete. And then also, to add to that, what do we do with this data and this research afterwards? How do we share it? Data sharing gets a bad rep at the moment. No one wants to share their data with third parties, but when it comes to private operators and cities and local authorities working together, they really need to share data with each other. Each has really interesting data on a lot of these things, and also academic institutions. How do we better share data? And I think that's a lot of the stuff that my organisation Polis does, around how do we bring private operators and local authorities together to encourage data sharing in safe and secure and legal ways, because actually we've done a lot of work with local authorities, asking them what is their data sharing capacities, and they're very low. And then you ask private operators, what are your data sharing capacities, and they're far higher. And each has a lot to benefit from this data, because with this data you can design much better mobility systems, and we should be a lot.
So seems like we lost Isobel in middle of his sentence. So I would suggest to give the word to Alexandra in the meanwhile. We have to add something to these ideas. Oh, yeah.
Yes, thank you. Well, there has been a lot mentioned already, and the importance also of qualitative data, because it's of course important not just to know how people are getting around, but also why they do it in a specific way. And what we like to do is combining actually qualitative and quantitative data, and it's also depending on the research question in which what goes first, for example. So if we have not much of an idea of a specific phenomenon, we would like to start with the qualitative phase to get some kind of an idea and to draw some hypotheses, and then try to get a more complete picture with a quantitative survey, for example. Or the other way around, we observe something, or we have quantitative data, and we want to understand why it is, or why we see these phenomena and these issues, and then we use qualitative data afterwards. So it really, there's a kaleidoscope of different methods, and it's really difficult to pick one. Maybe one I would like to mention, because it kind of solves a little bit the issue of stated preferences. What we do, we have developed a tool where we can, it's called the SP of RP tool, where we can, we ask people first what is their usual mobility behavior, so what are the trips they are taking, and which mode of transport, and a little bit about the access to different forms of transport. And then we construct choice experiments within the same survey, online survey. So they get presented alternatives to their usual trips with different modes of transport, for example, or at different times and so on. And we describe the alternatives so that they can see what would this alternative look like in their normal daily routine. And then we ask them, would this alternative be acceptable for you, and why not? So that gives us a lot more insight into the choice behavior than just asking, would you ride by bike, or would you do this, or would you do that? Because usually people cannot really imagine that in their usual daily life. And another thing I would like to mention is we have at the moment, we have a project with young people, with youth, and trying to understand also what are their different motives. And it's also extremely important for us to make sure that we invite those and work with also hard to reach groups, not the usual suspects, that are already interested in sustainability, or those who have a higher level of education, for example, because they are also more willing to participate in studies. So really how to make sure that we have a balanced sample of people being involved. And we work with social milieu studies, for example, and different segregation approaches to make sure that we really also get a better insight into the behavior of people who are usually not that willing to share their experiences, because either they don't want to, they feel intimidated in a research context, or because they simply don't have the time to. When it comes to women, for example, taking care of children, they don't have time to participate in studies. So that's very difficult to reach them.
Yes, so thanks a lot for your very different perspectives and ideas and inspirations. I think that's very useful for us, since there are many people in the audience working also in the research field and institutions. Thank you.
Yeah, and the next question could be like, if I don't work in science and I'm not a politician, if I'm just a civilian person that walks through the streets and uses mobility, how can I be in service to get a more inclusive infrastructure and a culture? Do you have any thoughts about that? That would be interesting, maybe for or some people out there.
Get organized with your community, because you are the experts of your community. Get organized and push and pressure. It's much more complicated, but I guess that the response is that everybody can do things at the individual level also, no, right? The type of decisions that we make on consumption and mobility and the type of place that we live and the type of life that we live, it has an influence. But also, definitely, I mean, looking ways also to find ways to push things in a community way. I know that in different contexts works differently, but we cannot wait that the public institutions give response to everything. Well, even though maybe you live like in more countries that are more responding to the welfare state, in South Europe, that's very different. So we know already that the state don't respond to everything. And I think it's important that the people, the citizens, people have also responsibility to contribute to their work as a community in changing things. So we cannot only wait for the governments to solve everything.
Yeah, thank you. Maybe you have one or two concrete examples how one could organize themselves?
Well, I don't know. I mean, here, you mean from Barcelona? I mean, we live in a city that actually there is a long history of community and neighborhood of organizing. You have to think that we have an anarchist past, and that influenced a lot in the activism. So there is a lot of activism in terms of cycling, for example, right? That people that in more formal and informal institutions, that are organizations, right, that are doing demands and to get like certain cycling infrastructures in certain places, and they organize and stop the traffic and things like that. But I mean, I can give you different examples, but also in terms of public transportation, I remember, for example, a way that in one train line that was really, really slow and that never accomplished the schedule that says in the webpage. It was always in delay, something that probably you don't know what's that in Germany, because you always go on time, but here it's not. The public transportation always goes late. So even, I'm joking, sorry. It's the time of the day and it's a Saturday. So even the users organized through the social media, through the social networks, and started to campaign to shame kind of the public transportation company to also increase frequency, for example, and things like that. So I don't know. There are many examples, but I guess that is a way to get documented and see where are the needs and where are the people who are interested, and how we can include a diversity of people in this like organizing process, right? Because sometimes there are people that push for it, but make sure that we are looking at the different needs of that community. I think it's much more complex, sorry. And maybe, I don't know if I give like the correct answer, but I'm tired.
There's probably no correct answer at all, but thank you very much.
There's no incorrect answer.
Yeah, that's as well. Yeah, Alexandra, do you want to add something? What do you think?
Yes, I would add also just in your daily routine, and this is something that everybody can do, just be more attentive, look around, look at the people around. How are they doing? Do they experience any difficulties? And you can either help them, but also collect your impressions and then share it with your immediate surroundings, with your friends, with your family. We need to get more aware of the situation, that not everybody has the same chances and that we encounter difficulties. So the more people talk about it, the more we get aware of it. So everybody can start. You can start. It's a small step, but if the more people do it, the better. And then also find, you can engage yourself. You can become active, but if many people don't feel like that, and that they are not necessarily that active, but they can share their experiences. Find somebody who is active and who is engaging and who is trying to get information and support from different people. So there are many steps what you can do. The lowest would be more attentive and talk about it, up to be an anarchist and go to the streets and demand the mayor to change something. So there are many roles. There's a role for everybody. It's just important that we take a role. It could be the smallest role, but we need to take. Everybody needs to take a role.
Yeah, and I agree, Alexandra. And I would not underestimate the personal responsibilities that we have and the things that we can do at the personal individual level to change things. Because changing the system is very complicated, but I guess at the personal level, like try to make some changes and resist to some things that are imposed, etc. It's a way to start, I guess.
Yeah, thank you very much. Feel really encouraged by your words and feel a lot of energy. And so I think we're closing slowly. If there's anything you want to add, now it's the time. Or if there's any last question. I think we lost Isabel. Or are you here? I don't think so. Yeah, I think we don't have any questions in the chat. So
I say thank you so much for inviting us. It's been a pleasure. And thank you and congratulations for the initiative of the conference and all the work that you have put on organizing.
Yeah, thank you very much for your inspiring words and your thoughts and for the work that you're doing in the world.
Yeah, of course, I'm also very grateful to have been invited. And Sarah, you do great work. And I hope we also can exchange some of our experiences. And kudos. Kudos to the organization.
Nice to meet you.
Absolutely. And just one more thing. We have initiated the Center for Mobility Change in Austria. And everybody who is, it's only in German, so everybody who speaks German, I invite them maybe to look for the Center for Mobility Change in Austria, or I think it's changemobility.at. We have a wiki there where we explain mobility behavior and mobility behavior change and all the barriers and what makes it difficult. So everybody who looks for practical examples and also wants to understand mobility behavior in more detail, I invite you to go to the homepage, maybe drop us a line, ask something, get in contact. We'd be very happy about that.
Okay, now also thanks very much to the audience for your questions and your presence. I hope everybody has a good night and enjoys the poetry night. And bye-bye.
Thank you. And a pleasure to share with Alexandra and to learn from you. Inspiration. Thank you.
Yeah, you as well.
All right. Have a
great evening.
Good evening. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.